A question I get asked a lot is, can you make a traditional style door wreath without using moss? And I always say, of course you can. All you need for this project is a wire wreath frame and some garden trimmings, or perhaps some bits of greenery you've foraged on a local walk. The golden rules for foraging are: don't trespass, always ask permission, only pick what you need, and don't disturb any local wildlife sites or areas that are specifically protected. For my wreath, I've used a raised wire wreath frame. They also come flat as well, and you've got the option of using garden string or mossing wire, and today I'm going to be using the mossing wire, and I've also got my secateurs to hand to help cut through my woody stems. For my wreath, I'm going to be using some blue spruce, some trimmings from my Christmas tree, some yew, buried ivy that I'm picking here in my garden, and also a friend gave me some olive branches from a tree that she'd been trimming in her garden. You may like to add in some fresh red berries, perhaps holly or hawthorn or rose hips. Personally, I don't like using holly. I find it too prickly to work with. And I've never had much luck with the berries either. Once you've picked the branches, brought them home, and then wrap them onto your wreath, I find they fall off really easily. So I say save the berries for the birds, and if you want a flash of colour, there's lots of fake berries you can find on the market, or like me, add a decorative red ribbon at the end. As I'm not going to be using moss on my door wreath, I do need something that will pad out the base of my frame and prevent my decorative foliages from falling through the gaps in the wirework. The scrappy Leylandii conifer hedge at the bottom of our garden is going to be perfect for this. If you'd rather use moss as the base for your door wreath, please make sure you don't pick from the wild, and always buy either from your garden centre or your local high street florist. When you've gathered all your materials together, you'll now need to start cutting them to size. The pieces here I'm trimming are about a hand's length long. I'm going to be making quite a large door wreath, but if your door wreath is going to be a bit smaller, or you prefer a neater and petiter look, you could cut your lengths much shorter, perhaps just the length between your finger and thumb. I've picked these bunches of ivy not so much for the greenery but for the lovely decorative dark buried heads, so I'm trimming those off the main stem and getting rid of the woody bits, which I'll put on the compost heap. To start off your wreath, you'll need to take your mossing wire or your string and just attach it onto the outer edge and give it a bit of a tug just to make sure it's secure. Then take a bunch of conifer, perhaps 3 or 4 stems, and start to bind them onto your wreath frame, pulling tightly every time you go round just to make sure everything is really secure. And if you find that any of your stems are particularly woody and they're sticking out, you can use your secateurs and trim them off. As you can see, I'm making my door wreath out on my patio table. You could make it indoors, but just be warned, you'll end up with twigs and greenery all over the place, which makes tidying up afterwards a bit of a pain. Once you've bound on your first length of conifer, take another bundle of stems and overlap them and keep binding and wrapping, and then eventually you'll end up with a complete green circle. When you get back to the beginning, don't cut off your wire, as you'll need this to add on your more decorative materials, and don't fret too much about what the green base looks like, because eventually this will get covered up, but if you feel any twiggy bits need cutting out, you can do that now. Now that the base of your door wreath is completed, the creative and fun part starts, and you'll see me here picking up pieces of greenery and arranging them in my hand, a little posy, and then I'm going to tie them onto my wreath, bind them in place using exactly the same action as I did for my conifer. Once you're happy with the posy of greenery you've made in your hand, lie this on top of your wreath frame and use your wire to tie it and bind it into place. You probably want to wrap around 2 or 3 times, just making sure it's going to be really secure. Once your first posy of greenery is attached onto your wreath, you can start making up the second in your hand, picking the greenery that pleases your eye and making sure if you are using anything distinctive, you're going to be able to distribute it evenly around your wreath frame. Taking the posy in your hand, attach it onto the wreath, with your wire again, making sure that all the decorative tips of the greenery are lying on top of the stems of the previous posy. And that way you go around the wreath frame in the same direction and you won't be able to see where you started and where you finished. For your peace of mind, you might want to give your wreath a shake every now and again just to make sure that nothing is falling out of it. And if it does, just go back in and wind over, pulling your wire really tight each time, and just continue doing exactly the same thing. Make poses in your hand, making sure they're about the same size and length as each one that's gone before, laying those decorative tips over the stems of the bunch before, and then wrapping over 3 or 4 times to make sure everything is firmly held in place. And here's another angle showing you in more detail what I'm doing. So I've already added on the next posy of greenery. I'm binding it over and over with my wire, putting it as tight as I can without hurting my fingers, just to make sure it's firmly in place. And once that's done, I'll add in my next lot of greenery. As you see here, I've nearly finished off my wreath. I've just got that small section to finish off. So everything is looking really beautiful, lush and full, with my materials evenly distributed throughout. When you come to finish off your door wreath, just remember that you need to lift up the tips of the first posy of green that you added in, and make sure that the stem ends of your last posy are tucked right underneath, and that way you'll get a lovely even continuation of green going all the way around your wreath. If you finish off too soon, you'll end up with a little dip. And there's no problem with that. You could put a great big ribbon on it to cover that indentation, but just take a few extra moments to make yourself a couple of more posies, just to make sure that you're going right underneath. And as you're finishing your binding, you will need to not get carried away and continue binding on your stems and accidentally catching in the tips of the first posy. Lift them out, flip them back, and make sure you're going underneath them, and then let them rest back in place. You'll see me taking my own advice here, and I've decided to add in 1 extra piece of greenery, making sure I take care to ensure that it's only these stem ends that I'm binding on, and I'm not accidentally catching in the decorative tips of the first posy of greenery that I added in. And then when you're happy that no more is needed, run off a length of the wire, and then what I do is turn the wreath over and stitch in, tie off the wire, and then bury the cut end into the body of the wreath so it doesn't scratch my front door. And then you'll have a finished wreath all ready for hanging up. And of course you could add in extra decorative details, pine cones and cinnamon sticks and orange slices, and even decorative berries. For a splash of colour, I'm going to add a bow to my door wreath, and I've got some red and white ribbon here which I'm keeping on the reel, and also a floristry wire off to one side to tie my bow in place. So I'm making my bow by fashioning a series of loops in my hand, and then when I've got all my loops in place, I will lay my floristry wire across the middle and tie it securely in place, and this will give me 2 little legs that I can then fix into my door wreath to hold my bow in place. I'd love to know whether you're planning to forage for your own DIY door wreath this year. Let me know in the comments below. And if you're thinking of making a traditional moss door wreath, I've got a DIY masterclass that you can download from my website, and I'll leave the link to that in the show notes underneath the video. That's all from me for this time. and I'll see you again in the next video.